She was only 6 years old, still clutching dolls and playing in the gardens of the royal French court, when her life was forever altered. Isabella of Valois, the daughter of the most powerful monarch in Europe, was placed on a ship and sent across the English Channel, not for a visit, but for a wedding. Her groom, a man nearing 30, King Richard II of England, troubled, childless, and desperate for peace. This is not a love story. This is a tale of diplomacy, politics, and sacrifice. Of a little girl thrown into the lion's den of English court life, where her golden crown sat heavy on a head far too young to understand the weight of empire. This is the story of Isabella of Valois, child queen, widow at 10, and one of the most hauntingly tragic figures in the history of royal marriage. Isabella of Valois was born into a France fractured by war and weakened by madness. The year was 1389. The 100 Years' War between France and England had already raged for over half a century, and though battles came and went, the root causes of the conflict ran deep: competing claims to the throne, dynastic ambitions, and the control of land and legacy. Isabella was the daughter of King Charles VI of France, who would become known in history not for his strength, but for his madness. Charles experienced terrifying bouts of psychosis, sometimes forgetting who he was, or believing he was made of glass. These episodes would render the French monarchy unstable and force his wife, Queen Isabella of Bavaria, to act as de facto ruler. Isabella was intelligent, politically savvy, and fiercely protective of her children, but she was also deeply controversial. In a male-dominated court that mistrusted powerful women, Isabella was accused of everything from extravagance to infidelity. Accusations often steeped in misogyny and political resentment. Amid this chaotic backdrop, Isabella grew up in the gilded but tense halls of the Louvre. She was a princess in title, but more importantly, she was a valuable asset. In medieval diplomacy, royal daughters were bargaining chips, and Isabella, beautiful, poised, and daughter to the King of France, was among the most prized of all. From the moment of her birth, her destiny was never her own. She would not marry for love, nor even for alliance alone. She would be used, strategically, symbolically, to shape the future of Europe. At just 6 years old, her life would take a dramatic turn. She was selected to marry Richard II of England, nearly 5 times her age. It was not an arrangement forged by affection, but by the hope of peace. Richard II of England had been on the throne since he was a boy. By the late 1390s, he was a man of 29, with no heir and a troubled reign behind him. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died in 1394, leaving him grief-stricken and politically vulnerable. England itself was restless. The nobility was fractious. His court was increasingly viewed with suspicion. But perhaps most pressing was the ongoing war with France. The 100 Years' War had depleted treasuries, devastated regions, and ruined countless lives. By 1396, both kingdoms were desperate for reprieve. It was in this climate that the idea of a royal marriage was born. A union between the English king and the French princess could serve as a living truce, a human embodiment of diplomatic hope. And so, Richard agreed to marry Isabella of Valois, a girl just 6 years old. For Richard, the political calculus was obvious. Though he was marrying a child, it bought him peace, at least for 28 years, the length of the truce that accompanied the marriage. It also offered him the chance to position himself as a man of statesmanship and vision. For the French, the benefits were equally clear. Isabella's marriage would secure her future and strengthen French influence in English affairs. Her father, Charles VI, despite his mental instability, approved the match. Her mother, Isabeau, may have had reservations, but she knew her daughter's value on the European stage. In October 1396, the French court prepared for the journey. Isabella was dressed in splendid robes and sailed to Calais, where she met her groom. Chroniclers of the time noted how poised she appeared, how graceful. But beneath the ceremony, the truth was stark. A 6-year-old girl was being married to a man 23 years her senior for reasons she could not begin to grasp. The ceremony was lavish. Richard reportedly treated her kindly, with paternal affection rather than romantic intent. The marriage was never consummated, not until Isabella reached an appropriate age, if ever. For now, she was a queen in name, a political gesture wrapped in silk and gold. But behind the smiles and feasts, history had already begun to turn. Richard had made powerful enemies, and little Isabella was now tethered to a kingdom on the verge of crisis. Her arrival was treated with all the pomp and spectacle the English court could muster. Chroniclers recorded the richness of her garments, the jewels, the music, and the grandeur of her formal entry into London. But behind the curtains of ceremonial brilliance lay the uncomfortable truth. This was a royal pageant masking an unsettling reality. When Isabella stepped onto English court, she entered a world very different from the court of France. The English court, still mourning the death of Queen Anne, now had a queen who could barely read or write, let alone command a household. At only 6 years old, Isabella was still learning to tie her own shoes. Now she had to learn how to play queen. Isabella was placed in the care of noble women assigned to guide her, protect her, and educate her. Her household was structured like that of a queen consort, but tailored for a child. Her duties were few, her presence largely symbolic, but she was closely monitored. She was allowed occasional visits to Richard, who reportedly doted on her in an almost fatherly way. He gave her gifts, jewels, and referred to her fondly as "my little queen." There was no scandal in their relationship, not in the physical sense. Their marriage was not consummated, and likely never intended to be, until she reached an age of maturity. But symbolically, Isabella was still the wife of England's king. That placed her in a peculiar limbo, a child consort, queen in name, but ward in practice. And yet, even as a child, Isabella represented something powerful. Her presence was a constant reminder of the uneasy peace between England and France. Her French roots, her fragile innocence, her ties to the Valois dynasty, they were all loaded with political weight. She became, perhaps unwittingly, a figure of both comfort and suspicion. While Richard presented her as a promise of future unity, others in the English court saw her as a foreign implant, a silent symbol of French ambition. In public, she smiled. In private, she likely missed her mother, her language, and her homeland. But she adapted. Her tutors taught her English. She learned the customs of court. She watched, listened, and waited, all before her 10th birthday. And then the world turned. Richard's reign teetered on the edge. His enemies were plotting, and the girl who had barely begun her life would soon face a loss no child should endure. By 1399, the cracks in Richard II's reign had widened into fault lines. Years of autocratic rule, erratic policies, and noble feuds had weakened his grip on the throne. His confiscation of the estates of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, after the death of Henry's father, John of Gaunt, lit the fuse. While Richard departed for Ireland to suppress rebellion, Henry returned to England with an army. What began as a campaign to reclaim his inheritance swiftly transformed into a political revolution. Richard, isolated and outmaneuvered, was captured upon his return. It was a stunning reversal of fortune. Isabella, just 10 years old, had little understanding of the perils swirling around her. The king was taken to the Tower of London and then moved to Pontefract Castle. There, in murky and controversial circumstances, he died, likely murdered, early in 1400. Some accounts suggest he was starved. Others claim he was stabbed. But the truth is this: his death marked the end of the Plantagenet line and the rise of the Lancasters. For Isabella, it meant more than political change. It meant the death of her husband, her protector, and her purpose in England. Overnight, she was transformed from a child queen to a powerless widow. She remained in England but kept under watch. Courtiers recorded her mourning, dressed in black, weeping for a man she had barely known but who had been by law and ceremony her husband. She lived in dignified captivity, her future uncertain. Henry IV, ever the pragmatist, proposed an audacious plan: that Isabella should marry his own son, Prince Henry, the future Henry V. But the French court was appalled. The Valois had no intention of seeing their daughter passed from one English monarch to another like a diplomatic token. After months of negotiation, Isabella was finally allowed to return to France in July 1401. She crossed the Channel older now, her innocence frayed by grief and exile. The child bride had become a teenage widow. Isabella's return to France in 1401 was bittersweet. She was welcomed with open arms, but she was no longer the vibrant child who had once departed. At 12, she had seen death, betrayal, exile, and widowhood. In 1406, just 5 years later, she was married again. This time to Charles, Duke of Orleans, aged 11. Isabella was 17. Unlike her first marriage, the age gap was reversed. The match was arranged to secure loyalties in the escalating civil conflict between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Charles was an artistic and sensitive soul. Despite their youth, the marriage showed signs of genuine affection, but it would be short-lived. Isabella became pregnant soon after. In 1409, just 3 years after their wedding, she died from complications during childbirth. She was only 19. Charles of Orleans would survive her by decades and immortalize her in poetry, making Isabella one of the few medieval queens remembered in verse, not just in politics. Isabella of Valois lived only 19 years, but within those years, she experienced the extremes of medieval queenship. Her story is a testament to how dynastic women shaped diplomacy and bore the consequences. She didn't rule armies or hold court power, but her marriages embodied the hopes and failures of two kingdoms. Her union with Richard II was meant to bring peace. Her second marriage linked factions in a France spiraling into civil war. Yet her greatest legacy may come from her silence, her endurance, her quiet grief, and the love expressed by a husband who never forgot her. She was a queen who never ruled, a widow before adolescence, a symbol, a sacrifice, and, ultimately, a human being lost in the shadow of kings. Let her story not be forgotten. She was queen at 6, widow at 10, buried by 19. In a world that treated girls like tokens, Isabella of Valois stood, however briefly, as a child queen who bore the weight of nations on her tiny shoulders. And though history may have buried her beneath more famous names, her story deserves to be heard, because behind every crown there is a human face. If you found Isabella of Valois' story as moving and unforgettable as we did, don't forget to like this video to support more historical storytelling. Subscribe to our channel for more untold tales from royal history, and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell us what struck you most about Isabella's remarkable yet tragic life.